Greetings and welcome to another lecture in psychopathology. What we're going to be talking about here are different types of treatments, starting with cognitive and cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, cognition means thinking. And so what these different types of therapies want to go into is changing the way that you think. Because the way that we think very often colors the way that we behave, the way that we view things. And so the idea here is we will simply change thought patterns that are not working well and replace them with thought patterns that are. Starting with rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT. Now, this particular type of therapy is basically looking into restructuring a person's belief system. Most of the cognitive therapies believe that our problems come from maladaptive thought processes, where either we may not think very clearly or very linearly, or else we believe things, we think things that are wrong, that are not true, and that may be holding us back. And so the idea here is that we're going to restructure our belief system and change the way that we evaluate ourselves, because that's something that both of these therapies that we're going to cover in this particular section of cognitive and cognitive behavior therapy believe, is that the ways we evaluate ourselves can very definitely feed into our psychological health. Particularly rational emotive behavior therapy believes that we need to get rid of our shoulds, our oughts, and our musts. And these are statements that we think, that we believe, and they're, as you could tell, they're all about our behaviors. We should think this, we should do that, we should know this, we should have this, we ought to be able to do that, we ought to have this, we ought to know that, we must know this, we must know that, we must do this, we must not do that. The thing is, a lot of times these shoulds and oughts and musts are not accurate. There's no reason why you should or you must or you ought for an awful lot of things that we make ourselves believe. That we think that if we don't do these things that we should or that we ought or that we must, that we're a failure and we're terrible and things will never turn out well for us. And so the whole idea here is to get rid of that. Get rid of the shoulds and the oughts and the musts and just do what we can and, frame things more realistically, frame things more logically. Okay? I could say all day that I should go into ballet. There is no way in God's green earth that I can go into ballet. I'm way too old. I'm way too fat. I don't have the right body build. I have lots and lots of problems with that. But if I'm busy beating myself up going, I really should know how to do that. I should be able to do the ronde-de-temps, and I should be able to do pliés, and I must be able, then I'm just going to hate everything about myself, even though, granted, I'm not a ballet dancer, but I'm pretty damn good. So the idea is to get rid of the unrealistic shoulds and oughts and musts and replace them with things that are more reasonable and more logical. Now, this particular therapy is not going to be really useful if you are in the depths of a huge, massive, serious anything. But it's pretty good for people who just are dealing with stress and have a bad tendency to beat themselves up. I know a lot of people who do that. I know I do that sometimes. So therefore, changing these thought processes to keep us from beating ourselves up can very often be extremely useful. Now, when we think of cognitive behavior therapy, when I've mentioned cognitive behavior therapy over the course of this class, very often this is what I mean. Beck's cognitive therapy, or Beck's cognitive behavior therapy. And the idea here is that we need to change our thought processes that underlie the behaviors that we don't like. It's all about the schemas. It's all about these cognitive structures that we think, the ways we think, the way we organize, the way we arrange things, the way we believe that things lead to one another even when they don't. And a lot of times these underlie behaviors that we want to get rid of. So the whole point of this type of therapy, and this type of therapy is not the loving, happy, you're a wonderful person and so am I kind of therapy we're going to get to next. This is where the therapist can and will argue with the person to try to get them to change these errors that they're making. The idea is that many of us have these automatic thoughts that as soon as we start thinking about ourselves or thinking about things we've done or should have done, it's related to the former. But, it's when we think about these things, we have these automatic thoughts. These automatic thoughts set us wrong. But we believe them because they're automatic, and because we've always believed them, and because other people believe them, and so therefore we believe them. And the thing here is to get people to stop believing them. And they include things like overgeneralization. Overgeneralization is just what it sounds like. When you generalize, you take things in one situation and you apply them to others. And overgeneralization, you make that ridiculous. Oh, this one person turned me down, so everyone hates me. Oh, I didn't do well in this one job, so I should not go anywhere near that career ever again. You're overgeneralizing. You're taking one situation and applying it to everything. Catastrophizing is something similar. In catastrophizing, people tend to see the absolute worst and blow it up out of all proportion. Oh my goodness, I just lost my job. I'll never work again. I'm going to wind up, dying poor in the gutter. And so, it's looking at the dark side, the bleak side, the terrible side of everything. Okay? Seeing the dark cloud behind every silver lining. Absolutism is another one. Things are either absolutely one thing or they're absolutely another. And the way we tend to see this in this situation is things are either absolutely wonderful, perfect, amazing, spectacular, or else they are terrible, awful, horrible, stupefying. You get the idea. And since virtually nothing is wonderful and amazing and so forth, that means that it's terrible and awful and horrible and stupefying and so forth. And so therefore people tend to view their lives as being much worse than they actually are. These are automatic thought processes. There's a lot more of them. These are just kind of the greatest hits here. There's a lot more of them. And the idea is to get people to stop thinking like that, to stop automatically going to these thought patterns. And it's actually been pretty darn useful for things like depression in particular. It's made a big dent in depression. Because a lot of times in depression, people do go for the worst. They think the worst, they believe the worst, they expect the worst. And when you do that, oftentimes if a good thing comes along, you don't even notice it. So yeah, eating disorders, same thing. I mean, some of this, like with eating disorders and substance abuse, these may have to do with dealing with lapses, dealing with falling off the wagon. Oh my God, I just smoked a cigarette. I've ruined everything. I might as well smoke 40 packs a day until I keel over. People do think like that. Or, oh my goodness, I ate too much today. I might as well go out and, eat 3 cakes and a cherry pie with ice cream. And in fact, that is not what you really need to do when you have a slight relapse, when you fall off that particular wagon. You need to climb back on. You need to figure it's not that bad. I can fix it. Let's just keep going. And so cognitive behavior therapy might be able to help people to not, go all the way off the deep end when things aren't as perfect as they would like them to be. And in fact, given a choice between this and rationally motive behavior therapy, this is definitely the winner. It does sound like sometimes when you talk to therapists and what technique they use, that this seems to be the winner in all situations. It's not good for everything, but it does seem to be quite good for some things. Next, here's the humanistic experiential therapy. Now, if you remember from your intro psych, humanistic therapy is all about us trying to be the best people that we can be and wanting to meet our potential, and the only thing that's stopping us from that is ourselves, and so we need help to remove our roadblocks and so forth. And that's basically what we're talking about here, starting with the classic client-centered therapy. And the idea behind client-centered therapy, first of all, these were the first people that used client instead of patient, because patient is just so doctor, patient, doctor way up here, patient way down there. Client is more equal. And the client here is at the center of the therapy. The client is who's in charge of the therapy, because according to humanistic psychology, it's the people who know what's wrong with them. They just sometimes need to have it pointed out to them. They don't know that they know it, or they won't believe it unless it comes from someone else. So the idea here is to help clients become able to accept themselves and be themselves. Have them be happy with themselves. Which in some ways sounds like cognitive behavioral, and in fact they probably have a lot of similarities. They just go about it in very different ways. In this case, client-centered therapy, people explore their real feelings, both good and bad, and accept good and bad. A lot of people think that they shouldn't be having bad emotions or bad thoughts or bad feelings, and that because they have them, they're bad people, when in fact everybody has bad emotions and thoughts and feelings. It's just that for the most part, what you want to do is simply say, okay, I've had it, bye-bye, and not brood about it or dwell on it, or drood on it if you want to combine those first two. So you got to explore these feelings. And in this case, the therapist is not in charge. The therapist is not running this. What the therapist is there to do is to mirror the client. And by mirroring, what I mean is very often the therapist here is simply repeating back to the client what the client just said. Because as I mentioned before, a lot of people, they know what they need to do. They know the answer. They're just not going to believe it until it comes from someone other than themselves. Or they might not know it very clearly unless someone takes it and just kind of, boils it down to its essentials and says it back to them. The therapist is also there to provide unconditional positive regard. And this is a really good example of why the therapeutic alliance needs to have, emotions involved. Because the idea here is that a lot of humanistic psychologists believe that the reason that people don't like themselves and don't like aspects of themselves is because they did not get unconditional positive regard from their parents. Unconditional positive regard is when you know that someone will love you for you no matter what damn fool stupid thing you do. Hate the sin, love the sinner. And unfortunately, a lot of parents don't parent like that. Instead of saying, that was a bad thing you did, they said, you're a bad boy or you're a bad girl, and people start to think of themselves as bad. And so the idea here is that the therapist gives that unconditional positive regard. Yes, you may do bad things, but that doesn't make you a bad person. And kind of hammers that home until people might actually come to believe it. And that's more or less the point of the humanistic. There's also motivational interviewing. And in motivational interviewing, this is more directional in that the therapist does do some steering here in terms of what's happening. It's also a lot quicker. Client-centered therapy could take forever, okay? Because you have to wait for the person to find the answer themselves and then let them know that they have found it. This is being more directional. It takes less time. It's still non-confrontational. There's no yelling, there's no arguing in this, unlike cognitive behavioral. It helps people resolve their ambivalence about change. A lot of people don't like change. They don't want change. We like things to stay the same. But unfortunately, things do change, and we do change. And we need to understand that we change, and we also may need to change the way we think about ourselves. So this tends to work well for things like substance abuse and addiction because, trust me, there's a lot of change that goes on with both substance abuse and addiction, okay? In that people need to change their behavior, they need to change their thoughts, they need to change the way they believe about themselves. Some people figure that they're not worthy, and therefore if they drink too much or smoke too much, who cares? You need to change that. So the idea here is to get people to accept change and to deal with it and to make a commitment to do this change. A real commitment, not just saying, oh sure, I'll change, but a real commitment. All without basically arguing. All being non-confrontational, all sticking to the humanistic view that the people who know best how to fix themselves are themselves. We'll continue on with more humanistic therapies in the next video.